Well, welcome everybody to the latest episode of HR Tech Chat. I'm very excited today to have Richard Limpkin, who is the Chief Product Officer of Immedis, which is a Dublin, Ireland-based global payroll provider. Welcome, Richard.
Hi, Brent. Nice to be talking to you again.
Yeah, we've had a couple of really interesting conversations in the not too distant past. Um, and both times, I don't know about you, but I really wish that I had the record button running because we covered some really interesting ground. And I know that we've been talking about this for a while, just various ideas around global payroll. What is the road to global payroll? How does an organization, when does an organization realize that it needs global payroll? To kind of stumble into it, or is there some sort of a little bit more of a plan there, these sorts of things. And we thought that this would just be a fantastic subject matter area of discussion for the podcast. So thank you so much for joining us. And why don't we dive right in? What are
Perfect.
some of the pain points for global organizations when it comes to their payroll? What are some of the headaches, the frustrations? What are some of these things that just can really get out of hand?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a myriad of different answers depending on the customer organization. I suppose if first of all, like we love to try and simplify everywhere we can, and that's probably at the core of what we try and do in Immedis. But the two most fundamental things really with payroll at the outset are timeliness and accuracy. And without either of those, then payroll is not really worth anything. That's the key fundamental. And then you can kind of layer on two other things that are really important to that in terms of compliance, and ultimately even more so in the environment we're in now, and in the technologically led environment and the globalization aspect of that, security, and an absolute concrete sense of security around protecting the privacy of your employees' data. So they're kind of, for us, they're the four really fundamental things. Two of them at the absolute core of it, though.
Interesting. Timeliness and accuracy. This is Imagine if your payroll were not timely or accurate. I mean, both of those
Yeah.
are just an absolute disaster. I remember reading a statistic, and I keep meaning to look it up again and find out exactly where its origins, but it's, and I don't remember the actual number either, but it's a very high percentage of employees that are they're willing to tolerate just one mistake in
Yeah.
payroll. And if after that, all bets are off. You're dealing with a retention problem. You're dealing with an employee sentiment problem. All these sorts of things. I mean, what's your take on that? I mean,
Yeah, it's like it's actually interesting. So a lot of the material actually that you would have published previously as well, Brent. You would talk a lot about the abstract and concrete aspects of HCM. Like I'm a massive fan of the kind of original theorists in HR theory. If you go back to things like hygiene factors, ultimately those base needs as human beings, they haven't really changed. People haven't changed in thousands of years. So that need for safety, psychological safety, physical safety, and the ability to kind of food and to feed and shelter yourself, well, that's really what pay is at the core of. That's what pay is enabling. So like the kind of original hygiene factor theorists would say that without that being right, nothing else really matters. You're nowhere even close to kind of self-actualization or anything else. So that's really kind of, in my opinion, that's why it's so fundamentally important still. And I don't think that's likely to change. It's, we live very much in a society driven by need and driven by the mechanics of finance to fund the various aspects of life. So, payroll being right and to expectation and timely, that's really the core of it.
That's really interesting. I'm so glad you brought up these sort of, these fundamental theories around, psychological safety, physical safety, these sorts of things, because And thank you for bringing up abstract and concrete HCM, because it's something I want to get into today. Pay is the most concrete aspect of HCM. I mean, we work for all sorts of reasons, to grow in our careers, to feel like we've done something that matters, or that we feel that we've accomplished something, all these sorts of things. But at the base of it, before any of that happens, just like you said, you have to, I mean, let me put it differently. If there is one common denominator among all people, they're working to get paid, and no matter where they're working, you could say if you're not working to get paid, or if you're working for subpar pay and you still love your job, then you could say that maybe it's more like you're volunteering, right? And you've been able to secure some sort of semblance of safety for yourself by other means, right? So, but setting that aside, right? That pay really is just that fundamental. It is the reason people are working. So it's interesting that and it also translates to it's a number. I mean, it is an indisputable number that that goes into the GL every 1-2 weeks, some places a month, every month. And that's indisputable. And that's the most measurable. So you could say it's the most measurable thing about HCM as well, right? And that's what we mean by concrete HCM is, financially quantifiable things that we can that we can influence in a way that's very readily recognized by accounting, for instance, right? But then the fact that it is so concrete. I had some window open up on my computer for no reason, but we're okay now. Sorry if I look distracted. This is reality podcasting. So anyway,
yeah, there's no legislating for anything that could happen here, so don't worry.
That's all right. That's all right. We'll leave it in. It'll be a good candid moment. So what's interesting to me is that payroll is the most concrete aspect of HCM for all the reasons we just said. And yet for that reason, you could make the argument that it's actually the most abstract aspect of HCM as well. And by abstract HCM, we mean, employee sentiment. How does it affect your employee sentiment, which is so essential and critical and fundamental to organizational success?
Yeah, 100%. And what's interesting when you put it in those terms, Brandon, I'd be very aligned with them. If you think about payroll, like ultimately it's a process, right? And I came from a very science-led background a long time before I ever kind of entered into HCM 20 plus years ago. So I kind of look at these things quite binarily sometimes to a fault, but like payroll, ultimately, you're absolutely right. It is quite concrete in that in most jurisdictions in the world, there is an absolutely correct way to calculate it, and anything else is wrong. Now there are a couple of jurisdictions where there's variances and nuances that you can take benefit of if you feel it's appropriate. That's all fine. But like ultimately, some of the more abstract aspects of HCM ultimately funnel and filter down into the payroll process. If you move from comp and ben and reward theory into what the actual tangible results of those are and how that then manifests, it ultimately filters into that concrete binary process of calculating payroll. And you're right, it generates a number. And that number gets paid to the individual. So it goes from being potentially quite abstract into being absolutely binary. And that's a key aspect of it. And then if you link that on to that binary number, again, back to the kind of basic management theory stuff, motivational theory, if that's wrong, then you're disabling everything else. That's the really fundamental part. And you start to think about financial well-being and the stress factors of finance challenges, then that can layer into it. So it can all really compound. You can go from maybe very abstract to very binary to very abstract again, all through the same process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes you wonder, well, I think we're essentially saying this, right? That there are so many rules and there's so much exactness around pay because it's concrete, but it is so concrete because it's so abstract. It's kind of interesting, right? Because there's so much employee sentiment behind it, right? It is
Yeah,
that thing that you absolutely have to get right, not just because of it being a number for the GL, but because there's so much, you know, psychological and emotional
absolutely.
need associated with it. That's just fascinating. That's a rabbit hole that we could keep going down all day long, I think. Bringing it back to global payroll, though. We're
Mm,
talking about some of the pain points around global payroll. There's timeliness and accuracy, obviously, which is shared with any payroll, even in just within one country, right, or within
yeah,
one
100%.
region, maybe Canada and the U.S. But data security, and I'm guessing also data, maybe data visibility. I mean, can you just dive into this a little bit? What are some of the ways that, well, maybe you could paint a picture for us, for instance, there are many uh, possibilities here, potentialities, but if you could paint for us a picture of an example of, for instance, of an organization that has sort of stumbled into needing global payroll, and maybe you could speak to the security and the data visibility piece of it, and how that might trigger that organization to say, oh gosh, we need to bring order to this.
Yeah, totally. And it's a great example, Brent, because there's not a lot of organizations that kind of from a startup stage would set out to say, right, we're going to start up in 20 countries and we're going to have a global requirement from day one. In majority of cases, what typically happens in the trajectory, now obviously each customer is on a different point of the trajectory, but they start out with a relatively manageable domestic payroll process, which is well within the bounds of the capability of their teams and the resources they have. But over time, as businesses grow and expand, whether that's through mergers and acquisitions, whether it's through organic growth, all those different dimensions, they start to have requirements in multiple jurisdictions, and then managing the complexity of those jurisdictions. And go back to that previous point of every one of them being very exact and very precise, but potentially quite different to each other. It becomes an increasingly complex kind of conundrum of how you manage that. So you've got to provide data from a central core to all these different processes and systems globally. And that becomes quite challenging. And the key thing with securing anything is knowing where it is. If you don't know where something is, it's very difficult to secure it. So one of the things we've really focused on, particularly with the Immedis platform, is the concept of not having those legacy processes where somebody, for example, is running an extract from one system to then securely encrypt that and send it to another system to unpack that and import it somewhere else. The whole drive towards web services and having that kind of stateless data concept. So things only exist at the point of origin or the point of purpose. You start to eliminate some of those weaknesses in the process. And any process is only as good as its weakest link. So we're really focused on that.
So the point of origin being point A, and the point of purpose being point B, the pay actually being delivered to the employee.
Yeah, so you're typically in global, you're depending on the maturity of the organization, your kind of point A, your origin will typically be, and it's been through massive consolidation in the HCM technology space. You'll have typically a HCM core system, which is in most situations, and again, there's little local nuances on data protection and what can and can't be done, like Russia is an example of high complexity for that. But you'll have a centralized system for managing HR processes and the vast majority of the employee lifecycle, a lot of which can be relatively homogeneously managed. There will, of course, be nuances to each process in each jurisdiction, but relatively homogeneous for a globalized organization. But then you're right down into the mechanics of the calculation in country and having to then separate that data out to each of the jurisdictions to process and execute in a payroll engine. That's really where you're going to the point B. How do you go from that centralized core, and not necessarily even one core? It might be a HCM platform plus potentially an external benefits global platform or a time and workforce management system, and getting those into the right place securely to be able to have every data point you need to calculate payroll, even though each of the data points may be different in each jurisdiction. So it's that kind of almost spider web of getting things aligned and consolidated without losing control of where they're going and without that becoming a hugely manual process for a team that have to manage that centrally.
Mm. How much of that is so that's very much a technological process, correct?
Yeah, it is very much tech enabled, but there is a massive service aspect to that as well. And in terms of good HR business process, globalized design, those types of aspects that can really drive good behaviors. So we would often consider, is a customer really ready for global? Are they actually looking for lots of local domestic situations, or are they on a truly global journey and ready to engage in a globalized model? So that is a big piece of it as well. That process engineering from a HR perspective, data readiness, they're all key components of enabling good global payroll.
So in other words, an organization could have a global footprint, but not necessarily be ready, not necessarily need just yet a full-fledged, consolidated global payroll solution. It could be that they just need some assistance at the local and regional level, wherever their locations are, to just to help facilitate the proper processing of payroll each period. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and you can absolutely enable that through technology. But maybe an example would be, if you look at some of the, not to name any, but if you look at leading kind of professional service firms, they would classically have grown up as a much smaller number, globally distributed limited liability partnerships. So they were almost isolated practices, and they came under a single banner, and they grew and they consolidated some processes. But not all of them would have consolidated things like HR, finance, payroll into a common core. So they could still be operating at a country level, potentially maybe a regional level. And part of executing really good global solutions for HR and payroll is around alignment of that. It doesn't mean that everything has to be identical by any means, but it does mean that you should be operating relatively similar processes and get the overall global outcome and efficiency from that.
Let's take a and this might be this might be too vague, so stop me if it is. But let's take a global organization that well, let me ask you this: what size, in terms of number of employees, is an organization typically when it's become, objectively speaking, a global organization, if it is a global organization? So are we talking, let's say you have an organization that's 500 employees. That is it. Let me ask it this way. This is a better way to ask it. Let's say you have an organization that's 500 employees. That's kind of on the high end of a small business, right? Is it possible for an organization of that size to be global and actually need a global outsourced global payroll solution? Or are we talking about just every possible permutation here? There's so many idiosyncrasies that there's just too many possibilities to really taxonomize right now.
Yeah, there's no right or wrong answer to it, Brendan. It's a very good question, and really it depends on the circumstance of the organization. So if you take your example of the 500 headcount, if that's 500, let's say, for example, that's 250 in the US and 250 in Canada, would you consider that to be a global organization? Or if that was 250 in the US and then let's say 25 per country in 10 other countries scattered globally, you get a very different answer with the same number of people. So it's very much around the complexity of what's been executed, whether they're a global organization or not. I guess the right answer is that once you're in more than one jurisdiction, you're starting to head that way. But in terms of the requirement for the solution and what you'd get benefit from, it's really once you get into that multiple jurisdiction scenario that really you can potentially, as a business, you can outgrow the capability or even the economic model of servicing that yourself internally and actually being able to provide coherent solutions. If you've got 25 people in 10 different countries, does it make sense to have a payroll manager in each of those countries? If there's no alignment, maybe the answer is different. If 2 or 3 of the countries have very similar jurisdictions and you can have a regionalized center, So that's really where the complexity comes in. And what we see a huge amount of in global is what's referred to as kind of big head and long tail. So you quite often have that home jurisdiction, which would be very strong, and that's where a business may well have grown up originally. But then that disbursement as they continue to grow, and at the very tip of the long tail is quite often somebody who's been put in country to help set up in a new jurisdiction, or maybe the first wave of sales staff in that jurisdiction. So they're all equally important in terms of the trajectory of the organization.
And sales staff, that particular scenario just painted, right? I imagine that's a common scenario, and sales staff obviously have complex remuneration sort of makeup, right? So I would imagine that would be almost right at the get-go a very complex global payroll scenario for the head of that organization to manage.
Yeah, spot on, Brent. And quite often with those lead individuals moving into new jurisdictions, you're quite often dealing with potentially an expat scenario as well. You take your best people from established jurisdictions, and you let those individuals help you grow in another jurisdiction as well. Many organizations would grow that way, and it's quite often the best way of building offshore centers as well, that you take a combination of local and centralized resource and put them together for a period of time to establish and build. So all those complexities come into a single payroll in that chosen jurisdiction. So you've got to take all that into account. So you're spot on. That can be sometimes some of the more complicated stuff. It's not necessarily the scale. It's the opposite.
Yeah, and that's interesting to me. And what seems to be sort of forming right now is this idea that it's not necessarily how large the organization is, but more so how many locations it's in and the types of employees in the various locations. So you could have, let's go back to that professional services organization, maybe a fairly homogenous type of employee, and spread across many countries, that is going to be complex, but not as complex as what we were just describing, which could be a much smaller organization, but with all sorts of different types of employees with different pay related needs. This is actually might be a good segue into because I want to get into this compliance. We have there's as many, if not more, compliance scenarios as there are regions and localities globally. Can you just speak to that a little bit? How does a global payroll provider sort of solve for that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. If you think about take even a single jurisdiction in isolation, you'll have components of local government, centralized government, and US is a great example of a highly sophisticated. Like there's something like 18,000 different permutations of tax and social and everything else in the US alone. So that level of sophistication is actually increasing all the time. And if you then layer onto that technological advancements in the jurisdiction and governments starting to drive digital transformation as well in terms of how tax and payroll filings are returned and the immediacy of that. We've seen that in the UK, we've seen it in Ireland and other jurisdictions where real-time information is brought into play. Australia have done the same. That level of sophistication of technology is increasing all the time. Now, what it does mean is that the compliance regime is getting stronger and stronger. So there's an almost immediate and absolute understanding of how and when things are filed, and that kind of almost instantaneous receipting, particularly with real-time information and web service tax returns and filings of payroll. There's a requirement as soon as payroll is executed to file with government, and you're literally milliseconds later getting a receipt so that you know that that's happened and you've got confirmation. So that's really changing things in that way. But that's not everywhere. And if you think about a typical customer for us would be operating in 40 plus countries. not all of those countries would have that level of sophistication in the tax jurisdiction and systems. So you do need to make sure that you can cope and legislate for even the least sophisticated jurisdictions, even if that's actually retaining the confirmation of tax filings and receipts and payments, and actually being able to digitize and control where they're stored, so that when that customer is audited, that information is available and you have the control process around it. So that's actually, I guess that's kind of, it's synonymous with a lot of global payroll. You have a real spectrum of levels of sophistication across different countries and what's actually possible, but you can't lower the bar to the lowest. You have to push for the highest in every single individual one of them.
Yeah, I'm thinking of an analogy here with the engineering of a vehicle. For instance, some vehicles, the components are, they're in, like, let's say the electric window regulator is engineered to the same level of failure as, say, the transmission, which is engineered to last, I don't know, 300,000 miles or whatever, right? So I might be stretching this analogy, but I love automobile
I
analogies.
love
But
a good
this,
analogy though, so don't stop.
but I think you see what I'm saying. I hope you see what I'm saying, right?
100%.
You have a region that has this high level of compliance, mandated, right, required, right, and so
Yeah.
you would operate all regions to comply to that standard, so as to make the audit process as, I don't know, as straightforward and easy as possible for the user. Is this essentially what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what you're really striving for. Obviously, there are kind of slow moving parts in that. In some jurisdictions, it's extremely challenging, particularly developing world jurisdictions, very challenging to get some of those components in play. But ultimately, what you're trying to do is centralize that back into the customer. So regardless of the downstream process, the material they're dealing with, the certainty and the compliance aspect that then can be audited is the same. So that's a really big part of it. And again, that's an important part of global across the whole spectrum, from inputs into the global payroll process to the results of it, and even posting information into finance systems, actually being able to align that globally, even though every payroll across the 40 for a typical customer is calculated differently.
Right.
Ultimately, you're slotting that all back into the same finance system centrally, with the
Right.
same debit and credit and chart of account structure and nominal accounting, all those pieces. So it's just making sure that no one piece doesn't conform,
Right.
but at the same time, not making it so homogenous you can't actually execute what you need to in country.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also occurred to me that it's probably more efficient from the global payroll provider's part to engineer for that greatest complexity and apply that across the board than to engineer or to solve, excuse me, solve for every single locality to the level that's needed. Because the other thing is, if any locality starts to regulate more, well, you're already all set. Interestingly enough, right?
Yeah, totally. And look, that's all part of good product engineering. It's always, it's a little bit of a paradox of, like, do you go for the low hanging fruit? Do you get the quick win? Do you get something that you can solve that isn't the biggest business challenge but does prove a business case? Or do you solve the most complex thing on the understanding that that will then unlock all the rest? It's a little bit of both. And what really you're trying to do is solve with reusability. So whatever you build should never be for the specific case in point. And like, to go, your car analogy is a very good one. You don't build a car that can drive between, I don't know, New York and Boston, and that's the only thing it can do. You build
Yeah.
a car that can drive anywhere you want to drive it. And of course, you have to do different things. You put a different amount of fuel in it, you change the direction, you take different routes. But the point is, you built it in a way that solves all of those different challenges without even necessarily knowing what the challenge for tomorrow might be.
Yeah, I love that. That makes a lot of sense. There's a couple things I want to get to in our remaining time. So one of them is, and we'll put a sort of just a placeholder on it for the moment, is just a little bit more about concrete and abstract HCM, how it, how it pertains vis-a-vis global payroll for various stakeholders in your organization. We can get, I think we talked about it from an employee standpoint already, in a I'd say a pretty nice way, but I'd like to get to some other stakeholders. But first, this occurred to me. I think this would be interesting. Can you share with us, obviously not sharing actual customers' names or anything like that, but can you share an example of maybe a customer that you thought, wow, these guys, understanding that global payroll is necessarily it's just sort of by design. There's no way getting around it, that it's something that you did figure out that you need, that you put in place after you've gotten to the point where you need it, versus
Yeah.
sort of putting it in place beforehand, right? Is there any customer you've had where you thought to yourself, gosh, these folks, they really, I mean, they were on it right away. They just, this I wish I
Yeah.
wish all our customers were like this. They got it, nipped it in the bud right away. Have you had that sort of a scenario?
Yeah, definitely, Brent. I guess it almost every kind of conceivable area on the spectrum of being ready or not ready for global, we've seen a significant mix of that. There's a number of them actually that really stand out to me, and I guess they're the ones that they stand out for lots of reasons. But I think in any kind of project or implementation or anything to do with technology over the last 20 years, there's a few things that always stand out, and you remember them for sometimes for reasons that were challenging and sometimes for reasons that were brilliant. So there's definitely a few for me at the brilliant end. In terms of Immedis customers, there's a good number of them. And there's a couple that really stand out in terms of, to your point, of being on it and being on it before it began. And part of that is taking a really forward-looking approach to how ready you are, and being on that journey ready for global. What does that really mean? Well, it means that when they first went to market and implemented their HR platform, they did it in a way that they kind of brought everything in centrally, rather than implementing a country at a time and doing each one in isolation and pandering to local needs in every regard. They always had the concept of running things at least at a regional, if not a global level. So they'd gone through the exercise of consolidating their comp and ben. They'd looked at how people were remunerated globally. They'd aligned things that were similar and called slightly different things, but actually amounted to the same thing. All those kind of things that are a lot of hard work to do, but really important to the outcome and the efficiency of the organization. The ones that are at the top end of that spectrum were the ones that had already done that work. So when it came to actually executing, and back to your really important point about concrete versus abstract, they'd really moved from abstract to as close to concrete as they could on the HR business processes and data and everything else, so that when it came to the absolute binary of running payroll, they were much closer to that. And you still have the little weird things in certain jurisdictions where, let's say, for example, there's a particular type of employee reward you want to give for high performers, but in one or two jurisdictions, it's just not legally allowed to pay it as a tax-free benefit. It has to be dealt with differently. Even those types of complexities, they've started to take into consideration. So they're the really high performance organizations that can drive through global payroll at an incredible rate.
That's interesting. Yeah. So it's almost as if they read the right books, right? Okay,
Yeah, yeah, totally.
read all the right articles. Okay, let's make sure we do, because there's so many things to bear in mind for across the enterprise, not just in HCM, right? Or
Totally.
obviously payroll, that to have as streamlined, as straightforward of an enterprise software ecosystem as possible as you grow. And it's always occurred to me, gosh, it would be great if every organization could, you think about, small, SMBs, and you try to get them thinking about some of these things at the very outset. And I think that's a good exercise, but so many of them are just, they're focused on, their immediate, and often it's very concrete HR related needs, and you can't really blame them. It's not as if they're just being irresponsible or anything like that. No, that's just the nature of what it's all about at those beginning stages. Most organizations, when they're small, when they grow to the point where they need some sort of an HCM solution in place, it's because all of that ultimately automatable stuff has just become too much to handle from a manual standpoint. So yeah, so many parallels there. Have you ever encountered an organization that, or a situation where you thought, oh wow, they let that go a long time. We can fix this, uh, but but it's going to take some
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that the first thing I'd say is, would you be surprised by that? I guess not, because like part of the need and part of the reason to going to market for any kind of consolidated solution, but particularly global payroll, is you've potentially gotten to a point where you're struggling to manage the process, and struggling to manage the complexity. So quite often these things, and particularly payroll, it has been super underinvested in terms of technology. Historically, payroll was always the piece, it's the real thing of, if it's not broken, don't try and fix it. Back to the earlier points, if you make a mistake in the transition of a payroll, that can be damaging, so let's just leave it alone. That's been the kind of premise around payroll for, I guess, for the last 30-40 years. But we're at a critical point now where globalization is driving the need to change that, and businesses just simply cannot continue to scale without addressing that global payroll challenge. So quite often customers are in that situation. We're actually not sure what the path is from here. We've gotten to this point, and that's part of maturing as a business as well, as you go through those different stages of growth, potentially from early domestic business to a business doing globalized international business, but from small number of jurisdictions to having presence globally. It's not the same path for any organization by any stretch, but it's all part of growing up as a business, and your requirements change. So they need to facilitate those and to accommodate your workforce. And even, the piece you spoke to earlier, Brent, around the employee becoming more and more centric to that. We think of employee centricity as a key part of our roadmap, and everything we do is around trying to deliver to the employee, the customer of our customers, as we think of them. That's what's really changing in the marketplace as well. People's right to understand their data, where it's held, how it's managed, what it's used for. And that's really driving out of HR and into payroll as well.
Yeah, yeah. People taking just sort of you could make an argument for, we could discuss this for hours, but this idea, just the evolution of the employee's understanding of their relationship to their employer. It has moved beyond, I think, just in terms of where we are today versus say 100 years ago. I'd be hard pressed to imagine most employees asking, oh, what am I getting out of work aside from, my pay, right? Obviously there were professionals back then too, but that was also a career for them. Let's switch gears here in the remaining few minutes we have. Let's talk about abstract and concrete HCM, or it doesn't even have to necessarily be abstract and concrete, but what are some of the challenges that let's say the CIO or the CTO encounters specifically in HCM, and then if we have time, maybe a little bit about what's the domain of the CFO? What is the CFO concerned about? What are the potential pitfalls for finance and the CFO when it comes to global payroll being maybe not in order?
Yeah, totally. There's a big breadth of things there, and they are, I guess, the hats they wear are very different. Some of the concerns are very similar, but I suppose ultimately for if I take the CIO first, generally speaking, in most organizations, the protection of and security of all aspects of the corporate information, including the employee aspects of that, would fall in that remit. So typically in that role, the absolute certainty around how data is managed and secured, and increasingly so, the reason it's even held, and what it's used for become really quite central. So that certainty around how any SaaS provider or even internal system provider, how they secure the data, how they manage that, how they comply with an increasing number of local legislations around that, like GDPR and other aspects, data sharding, and whether certain aspects of a record could only be stored in certain jurisdictions. All those pieces are becoming increasingly complex. So they're very much CIO domain. So they tend to be the primary concerns around the ability to operate a complex landscape, but keep things safe. And a lot of that's about understanding what is where and why. That's probably the simplest way of looking at that piece.
So very much a compliance concern.
Yeah, data compliance, compliance with securing the data, storing the data, and ultimately processes around it. And again, back to any process, where are the weak links? Where are the things that are most likely exposed? And how do we manage and mitigate against those? So that's something we as an organization put an insane level of focus on for all the right reasons, and it's paramount that we do. The CTO then, interestingly, they tend to be less involved in the, other than the potentially initial selection and maybe some typically in our customer environments, less involved in the implementation aspects of a global HCM or payroll solution. They'd quite often lend resource in terms of integration and those types of aspects. But if you then look at the CFO, there's an increasing demand for data. Like every organization should be striving to become much more data-led. We're seeing the prevalence of chief data officers in many organizations, and the need to really use data in a way that can drive dominant change in a business and making the right decisions proactively for the right reasons. And payroll for a lot of organizations is a substantial, not for all, but for most organizations is a substantial chunk of the cost. Unless you're in a manufacturing environment where that can often be less so, raw materials can kick in. But that understanding of where the cost is, how the cost is managed, how efficient that is in delivering for the business in different areas. So being able to consolidate that data, get access to it. Again, to your point, Brent, around compliance, making sure that all the filings are accurate and correct, making sure that what was in a gross to net is absolutely what's posted through journals when it was rolled up and consolidated across multiple FX rates in a period. All those different things are under control. CFOs are a key stakeholder for us in most global payroll implementations.
Yeah, whether you're in a manufacturing organization or any other kind of organization, whether the payroll, that final number for payroll is the largest number or not, it's going to be a significant number for any organization.
Yeah.
And just like any other type of cost, it's going to be very much of interest to the CFO. So, and that CFO is going to want to have as much insight, like you said, into exactly what's going on with that number at all, conceivably all the time. So yeah, absolutely. And you know what, the data piece, the data security piece with the CIO that you mentioned earlier, obviously that's also employee sentiment thing, right? Because
very much so.
Yeah,
like it's so key, and we've seen a huge amount of that. A big piece of like GDPR is a much talked about thing, but a lot of what it really mandated was actually common sense behavior around data. There was nothing really in it that didn't make sense when you understand legislation and what it was mandating in terms of really what was central in the theme was putting the individual that the data relates to in control of that data. And it was a really important step in that direction, that ultimately you as the person own your identity and all aspects of that, and you're lending that to other people to use for a purpose, which is really important. So that you're absolutely right, that sentiment is fundamentally shifting, and we're absolutely seeing it even in the employee environment, employees being highly demanding and potentially rightly so as to why you have their data and what it's used for. How much of it is long-term stored versus short-term usage. All those types of dimensions are shifting and will continue to shift. Ultimately, I see the trajectory for the HCM market is likely to fragment not in the near term, but into almost a decentralized model where the person owns their record, and that record effectively becomes a HR passport that travels with the individual as they move through their career. And that kind of centralized storage, we're starting to see it with digital wallets, and certain aspects of the record in terms of maybe certification for education and courses you've sat, but that will propagate, and that's becoming increasingly important.
Oh, I think you're absolutely correct about that. And we spoke with a fellow on podcast, gosh, about a month and a half ago now, Mitch Zenger, who's the founder of Synctrix, and it's nothing to do with payroll, but it's this idea that the employee should own his or her own data, that it does not belong to the organization. And, we have entire data models that are built around the idea that that the organization owns the data, and that needs to change. I'll just leave you with this idea. It's so interesting that we ended up talking about GDPR and how a person's individual data belongs to them. This idea that it should. It's so interesting because I thought, to myself, I was walking my daughters down the road and looked at it. She wanted to go down someone's driveway. And I said, well, that's somebody else's driveway. We can't, that's their private property. And then I kind of jokingly talked to her about private property is very important. She's not even 3 yet. She didn't know what I was talking about, right? But I'm priming her. But the idea is that it was kind of a funny thing. But at the same time, right, it did occur to me in that moment that, we don't, somebody's not just allowed to walk in your property and just set up a tent or whatever. You got to invite them. They need to be invited. They need permission. It should be the same with their data online.
Yeah, 100%, Brendan. And if you take it to the next step as well, like some organizations would fear that in terms of employees being more empowered and in control of the data. But I look at that as a hugely positive step for everyone involved in the process. If you're looking for good, clean, accurate data, where are you most likely to get that? Well, the person that it relates to, who knows the absolute facts, how many dependents they have, what the age of the children are, those little simple things that in some jurisdictions influence how you're paid. Put that into self-service, which is what a lot of our customers are starting to adopt in the Immedis platform, is actually pushing that to the employee to self-manage. What it also does then centrally is it protects you as the employer, because if you don't have the data, you're not ever going to have an issue with that being held or why you're holding it. You're actually letting the employee drive that themselves for the very distinct purpose. They know why they're providing it. They know it's accurate, and everyone wins. So I see those being really positive steps in the industry, and I think they'll accelerate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you know what? That's another, that would be such an interesting cover. Maybe we can make that the subject of our next podcast together, Richard. How about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd
I'm
love
up
to.
for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. This has been just fascinating.
Yeah, likewise. Super to talk to you again, Brendan. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much.
No problem. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.